Imagine waking up tomorrow morning with the absolute certainty that nothing, no criticism, no failure, no betrayal, no loss could ever truly destroy you again. Picture yourself moving through the world with such unshakable inner strength that external circumstances become mere weather patterns across the landscape of your consciousness. What would you do differently? How would you speak, act, love, create if you knew that your core essence was completely invulnerable to the chaos surrounding you? This isn't fantasy. This isn't motivational rhetoric designed to pump you up for a few hours before reality crashes back in. This is the philosophical blueprint that Friedrich Nietzsche, perhaps the most psychologically penetrating mind in human history, developed for achieving what he called true invincibility. But here's the disturbing paradox that will shatter everything you think you know about strength. According to Nietzsche, the very things you believe make you strong are actually the invisible chains keeping you weak. Consider this unsettling truth. Most people spend their entire lives building what they think is strength, only to discover they've constructed an elaborate prison. They accumulate achievements, surround themselves with supporters, avoid difficult conversations, seek validation, and carefully curate their image, all while becoming more fragile, more dependent, more terrified of losing what they've built. They mistake armor for strength, not realizing that true invincibility comes from a place so counterintuitive, it sounds like madness. What if I told you that your deepest fears are actually doorways, that your greatest weaknesses contain the seeds of your ultimate power, that the very experiences you've been running from your entire life are precisely what you need to become truly undefeatable? Nietzsche understood something that most people never grasp. Invincibility isn't about avoiding destruction. It's about becoming the kind of person who can be destroyed 1,000 times and still emerge stronger. But here's where it gets psychologically disturbing. Most people who think they want to be strong actually want to be safe. They want the feeling of invincibility without the terrifying process of actually becoming invincible. They want the confidence without the crucible, the power without the pain, the transformation without the destruction of everything they currently are. Nietzsche would say these people are still slaves to their need for security, approval, and predictable outcomes. True invincibility, according to Nietzsche, requires something so radical that most people immediately reject it when they hear it. It requires embracing what he called amor fati, not just accepting your fate, but loving it. It means developing the capacity to look at every trauma, every betrayal, every failure, every moment of excruciating pain in your life and saying, I wouldn't change a single thing. Not because these experiences were pleasant, but because they forged you into who you are. Think about the strongest person you know, not physically, but psychologically. Chances are they've been through hell. They've been broken, rebuilt themselves, been broken again and rebuilt again. But somewhere in that process, something shifted. They stopped seeing their pain as something that happened to them and started seeing it as something that was happening for them. They became what Nietzsche called those who give style to their character. But this raises a terrifying question. What if your entire approach to building strength has been backwards? What if every strategy you've used to protect yourself has actually been making you weaker? What if the very foundation of your identity, your beliefs about who you are, what you deserve, how the world should treat you, is built on philosophical quicksand? The journey to true invincibility isn't about adding layers of protection. It's about stripping away everything false until you discover what cannot be destroyed. It's about finding the part of you that remains untouched regardless of what happens to your body, your reputation, your relationships, or your circumstances. Nietzsche called this your higher self, not in some mystical sense, but as the version of you that has fully accepted responsibility for your existence and chosen to create meaning rather than seek it. Before we dive deeper into this philosophical revolution, I want you to do something that will serve you throughout this journey. If this exploration of Nietzschean invincibility is resonating with you, hit that subscribe button and leave a like on this video. Not because I'm asking for support, but because engaging with content that challenges your fundamental assumptions about strength and weakness is itself an act of philosophical courage. It's a small but significant step toward becoming the kind of person who actively seeks truth rather than comfort. Now, prepare yourself for what's coming next. We're about to explore why everything you've been taught about building strength has been keeping you trapped in a psychological prison you didn't even know existed. We're going to uncover the hidden problem that makes most people's attempts at self-improvement actually work against them, and why Nietzsche believed that true power comes from the most unexpected place imaginable. The problem isn't that you're not trying hard enough to become strong. The problem is that you're operating under what Nietzsche called slave morality, a psychological framework so deeply embedded in human consciousness that most people never even recognize they're trapped within it. This isn't about politics or social hierarchies. This is about the fundamental way you've been conditioned to think about power, value, and what it means to be human. Here's the disturbing truth. Slave morality convinces you that your worth comes from external validation, that strength means never being vulnerable, and that the goal of life is to minimize suffering rather than maximize growth. It teaches you to see yourself as a victim of circumstances rather than the creator of your reality. Most importantly, it makes you believe that safety and comfort are more valuable than truth and self-creation. Nietzsche observed that slave morality originated from humanity's need to survive in hostile environments where the weak had to develop strategies to protect themselves from the strong. Over millennia, these survival strategies became so ingrained that they began to masquerade as virtues. Humility became more valued than self-assertion. Conformity became more prized than authentic self-expression. Seeking approval became more important than seeking truth. But here's what Nietzsche understood that most people miss. What was once a survival strategy has become a psychological prison. The very mechanisms that helped humans survive in primitive societies are now preventing them from thriving in modern life. You're still operating from a scarcity mindset in a world of abundance, still seeking safety in a reality that demands constant adaptation and growth. Consider how this plays out in your daily life. When faced with criticism, your first instinct isn't to evaluate whether it's accurate or useful. It's to defend yourself or seek reassurance from others. When confronted with a challenging opportunity, you don't ask, "How can this help me grow?" You ask, "What if I fail?" When someone disagrees with you, you don't think, "What can I learn from this perspective?" You think, "How can I prove I'm right?" This is slave morality in action. It's the voice in your head that constantly seeks external validation, that measures your worth by comparing yourself to others, that defines strength as the absence of weakness, rather than the integration of all aspects of your humanity. It's the part of you that would rather be comfortable than truthful, safe than authentic, liked than respected. Arthur Schopenhauer, who greatly influenced Nietzsche's thinking, identified this as humanity's fundamental error, mistaking the preservation of the ego for the preservation of the self. The ego seeks safety, predictability, and validation, but the true self, what Nietzsche called the Übermensch or Overman, seeks growth, truth, and self-creation, even when these come at the cost of temporary discomfort or social disapproval. Carl Jung later expanded on this insight with his concept of the shadow. Jung understood that true psychological strength comes not from rejecting your dark impulses, but from integrating them consciously. Most people spend enormous energy trying to be good according to external standards, never realizing that this very effort is what keeps them weak and fragmented. Nietzsche saw this pattern everywhere. People creating elaborate personas to hide from themselves, building identities based on what others expect rather than what they authentically are, seeking meaning through external achievements rather than internal development. He called this the herd mentality, the unconscious drive to blend in, to avoid standing out, to let others define what's valuable and worthwhile. But the deepest layer of this problem is even more insidious. Slave morality doesn't just affect how you see yourself. It affects how you see reality itself. It convinces you that life should be fair, that good people shouldn't suffer, that if you're kind and work hard, you'll be rewarded. It creates the illusion that you can control outcomes if you just follow the right rules and strategies. This is what Nietzsche meant when he declared God is dead. He wasn't making a theological statement. He was pointing out that the old frameworks for meaning and morality were crumbling, and that humans would have to create their own values rather than inherit them from external authorities. The death of traditional meaning-making systems forced a choice: remain trapped in outdated moral frameworks that no longer serve human flourishing, or develop the courage to create new values based on authentic self-understanding. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, discovered this truth in the concentration camps. He observed that those who survived weren't necessarily the physically strongest, but those who could create meaning from their suffering. They had developed what Nietzsche would call master morality, the ability to determine their own values and create meaning regardless of external circumstances. But here's where most people get stuck. They want the benefits of master morality without giving up the comfort of slave morality. They want to be self-determined while still seeking approval. They want to be authentic while still avoiding conflict. They want to be strong while still being safe. Nietzsche would say this is impossible. You cannot serve two masters simultaneously. The psychological toll of this internal contradiction is enormous. You end up living in a constant state of anxiety because you're trying to control things that are fundamentally beyond your control. You become exhausted from maintaining a persona that doesn't align with your authentic nature. You feel perpetually disappointed because reality refuses to conform to your expectations of how life should be. This is why most self-help approaches ultimately fail. They try to make you stronger within the framework of slave morality, like trying to build a skyscraper on quicksand. They offer techniques for managing anxiety rather than eliminating its source. They teach you to cope with weakness rather than transform it into strength. They promise comfort rather than growth, safety rather than authenticity, techniques rather than transformation. But what if there was a completely different way? What if true invincibility didn't come from building better defenses, but from becoming the kind of person who doesn't need defending? What if strength wasn't about controlling your environment, but about becoming so internally powerful that your environment couldn't control you? The invisible consequences of living under slave morality are far more devastating than most people realize. Like carbon monoxide, they're odorless, colorless, and deadly, slowly poisoning your capacity for authentic living while you remain completely unaware of what's happening. By the time you notice the symptoms, the damage has already shaped decades of your life in ways that feel irreversible. Here's the most chilling consequence. You begin to mistake your limitations for your identity. That voice in your head saying, "I'm not the type of person who," or "people like me don't," isn't wisdom. It's the internalized voice of slave morality, convincing you that your current boundaries are permanent features of who you are. You've confused your conditioning with your nature, your habits with your essence, your fears with your truth. Neuroscience reveals why this happens with such devastating effectiveness. Your brain literally rewires itself around repeated thought patterns and behaviors. When you consistently choose safety over growth, comfort over challenge, approval over authenticity, You're not just making individual decisions, you're sculpting the neural pathways that will determine your automatic responses for years to come. Every time you avoid a difficult conversation, you make the next one harder. Every time you seek validation, instead of trusting your judgment, you erode your capacity for self-reliance. But the neurological imprisonment goes deeper. Research on learned helplessness shows that when people repeatedly experience situations where their actions don't seem to matter, they eventually stop trying even when the situation changes, and they do have power. This is precisely what slave morality creates, a learned helplessness about your own capacity to shape reality according to your will rather than external expectations. Consider how this plays out in your relationships. Instead of expressing your authentic thoughts and feelings, you've learned to present a carefully curated version of yourself, designed to minimize conflict and maximize approval. You've become so skilled at reading other people's expectations and conforming to them that you've lost touch with your own preferences, desires, and boundaries. Your relationships become transactions. You provide what others want in exchange for their acceptance, rather than authentic connections between two sovereign beings. This creates what psychologists call rejection sensitivity, a hypersensitivity to any sign of disapproval that keeps you in a constant state of anxiety and people-pleasing. You begin to experience other people's emotions as more real and important than your own. Their disappointment becomes your crisis. Their approval becomes your drug. Their opinion of you becomes more influential than your opinion of yourself. In your professional life, slave morality manifests as what Nietzsche called the last man, someone who has given up the struggle for self-creation in favor of comfort and security. You settle for careers that feel safe rather than meaningful. You avoid taking risks that could lead to extraordinary outcomes because the possibility of failure feels more real than the possibility of success. You measure your worth by external metrics, salary, title, recognition, rather than by your own sense of growth and authentic contribution. But perhaps the most devastating consequence is what happens to your relationship with suffering itself. Slave morality teaches you that suffering is meaningless, that pain should be avoided at all costs, that discomfort is a sign that something is wrong. This creates what Viktor Frankl called an existential vacuum, a profound emptiness that comes from avoiding the very experiences that could give your life meaning and depth. When you refuse to engage with difficult emotions, challenging situations, or uncomfortable truths, you don't eliminate suffering, you just make it meaningless. Instead of suffering that transforms you, you experience suffering that diminishes you. Instead of pain that teaches you something essential about yourself and reality, you experience pain that serves no purpose except to be endured and escaped. This is why so many people feel stuck in cycles of anxiety, depression, and general dissatisfaction, despite having objectively comfortable lives. They've created elaborate systems to avoid discomfort, but in doing so, they've also avoided the experiences that could give their lives genuine meaning and direction. They're suffering anyway, but it's the meaningless suffering of stagnation, rather than the meaningful suffering of growth. The cognitive biases that emerge from this framework are particularly insidious. Confirmation bias becomes extreme as you desperately seek evidence that your comfortable worldview is correct, rather than seeking truth, regardless of whether it's convenient. The sunk cost fallacy keeps you trapped in situations that no longer serve you because admitting you were wrong feels more threatening than continuing to live a lie. Social proof becomes a prison as you look to others for validation of choices that only you can make authentically. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Slave morality doesn't just affect your individual life. It shapes entire cultures and societies. When enough people operate from this framework, they create collective systems that reward conformity over creativity, safety over innovation, and comfort over truth. They build institutions designed to manage weakness rather than cultivate strength, to provide security rather than promote growth, to maintain the status quo rather than encourage authentic self-expression. This creates what Nietzsche called the herd, a collective mass of people who have surrendered their individual will to create meaning in favor of inherited systems that promise certainty and belonging. The herd offers comfort, but at the cost of authenticity. It provides security, but eliminates the possibility of genuine self-discovery. It gives you identity, but only by sacrificing your individuality. The most tragic aspect of this invisible imprisonment is that most people defend it passionately. They've become so identified with their limitations that any suggestion they could transcend them feels like an attack on their identity. They've confused their coping mechanisms with wisdom, their fears with realism, their resignation with maturity. This is why true transformation feels so threatening to most people. It's not just about changing behaviors or adopting new strategies. It requires a fundamental shift in how you see yourself, reality, and your relationship to both. It demands that you question everything you've been taught about what it means to be human, what constitutes strength, and how meaning is created rather than discovered. The urgency of recognizing these invisible consequences cannot be overstated. Every day you remain trapped in slave morality, you're not just failing to grow, you're actively reinforcing neural pathways, relationship patterns, and life structures that make genuine transformation exponentially more difficult. You're not standing still. You're moving deeper into a psychological prison that feels increasingly like home. But what if escape were possible? What if there was a way to break free from this invisible cage and discover what Nietzsche called your will to power? Not power over others, but power over yourself and your capacity to create meaning from any circumstance. The path to true invincibility begins with the most radical act imaginable: complete responsibility for your existence. Not partial responsibility, not responsibility for the things you can control while blaming circumstances for everything else. Total, absolute, terrifying responsibility for every aspect of your experience, including how you interpret and respond to things that happen to you. This is what Nietzsche meant by becoming who you are. It's not about discovering some predetermined destiny or finding your true self hiding beneath layers of conditioning. It's about taking full ownership of the creative process of self-construction. You are not a victim of your circumstances, your past, your genetics, or your culture. You are the author of your own existence, and every moment presents you with the opportunity to write the next chapter consciously rather than automatically. But here's the revolutionary shift that most people miss. This isn't about positive thinking or manifestation or any other technique that tries to control external outcomes. This is about developing such profound internal sovereignty that external circumstances become raw material for your self-creation rather than forces that determine your emotional state. Jean-Paul Sartre captured this perfectly when he wrote that humans are condemned to be free. You cannot escape the burden of choice, even when you choose not to choose. Every moment, you're either creating yourself consciously or allowing yourself to be created by unconscious forces. There is no neutral ground, no safe harbor where you can avoid the responsibility of authorship. The first step in this rebellion is what Nietzsche called revaluation of all values. You must systematically examine every belief, assumption, and moral principle you've inherited and ask not, is this true, but does this serve my authentic development as a human being? Many of the values you've been taught to see as virtues, humility, selflessness, conflict avoidance, seeking approval, may actually be obstacles to your growth. This doesn't mean becoming selfish or cruel. It means becoming discerning about which values actually serve human flourishing versus which ones serve social control. True strength often requires what appears to be selfishness, saying no to requests that drain your energy, prioritizing your own development over others' comfort, refusing to participate in conversations or activities that diminish your authentic self-expression. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor, demonstrated this principle when he wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." But Nietzsche took this insight further. It's not enough to simply accept what happens to you. You must actively choose to love what happens to you. This is amor fati, the radical acceptance that transforms every experience into fuel for your becoming. Consider how this shifts your relationship with failure, criticism, and betrayal. Instead of seeing these as evidence that something is wrong with you or the world, you begin to see them as essential ingredients in your self-creation. The person who betrayed you didn't damage you. They revealed something important about trust, boundaries, and your own capacity for resilience. The failure didn't set you back. It eliminated an illusion and forced you to develop real strength rather than depending on external circumstances. Historical examples illuminate this transformation. Ernest Hemingway wrote his greatest works after experiencing profound losses and failures. Johnny Cash's most powerful music emerged from his darkest periods of addiction and personal chaos. Maya Angelou transformed childhood trauma into wisdom that inspired millions. These individuals didn't succeed despite their suffering. They succeeded because they learned to alchemize their suffering into strength. But this requires developing what Nietzsche called the courage of your own contradictions. Most people exhaust themselves trying to be consistent, to present a coherent image, to eliminate the aspects of themselves that don't fit their ideal self-concept. The path to invincibility requires embracing your full humanity, including the parts you've been taught to reject or hide. Carl Jung understood this as the integration of the shadow. Your capacity for anger, selfishness, destruction, and chaos isn't something to be eliminated. It's something to be consciously directed. The person who claims to never feel rage has simply repressed their capacity for righteous anger. The person who prides themselves on never being selfish has simply made selflessness into a form of disguised selfishness. True strength comes from owning all aspects of your humanity and choosing consciously how to express them. This means developing the capacity to be ruthless when ruthlessness serves life, to be gentle when gentleness serves growth, to be angry when anger serves justice, to be compassionate when compassion serves healing. The practical application of this philosophy requires daily acts of micro-rebellion against slave morality. When you feel the impulse to seek approval, pause and ask what you actually think or want. When you feel the urge to avoid a difficult conversation, lean into it and speak your truth with compassion, but without apology. When you catch yourself comparing your life to others, redirect that energy toward your own authentic development. Most importantly, you must develop what Aldous Huxley called the art of seeing, the capacity to perceive reality without the distorting filters of wishful thinking, social conditioning, or emotional reactivity. This means looking directly at yourself and your life without the comfortable lies that make weakness bearable. It means seeing your patterns, your excuses, your unconscious habits, and your self-deceptions with ruthless clarity. But here's the paradox that transforms everything. The moment you stop trying to be invincible and start being authentic, you become truly invulnerable. When you no longer need others' approval to feel worthy, criticism loses its power over you. When you no longer need circumstances to be different to be content, setbacks become opportunities. When you no longer need to maintain a false image, you're free to respond to life with spontaneous authenticity rather than calculated performance. This is why Nietzsche called it dancing with life. You're no longer fighting reality or trying to control it. You're engaging with it as a creative partner in your own becoming. Every challenge becomes a chance to discover new aspects of your strength. Every loss becomes an opportunity to find out what remains when everything external is stripped away. The rebellion against slave morality isn't a one-time event. It's a daily practice of choosing growth over comfort, truth over convenience, authenticity over approval. It requires constant vigilance against the gravitational pull of unconscious living and the courage to keep creating yourself even when others don't understand or support your transformation. But once this process begins, something extraordinary happens. You start to discover capacities within yourself that you never knew existed. You begin to access reserves of strength, creativity, and resilience that were always there, but had been suppressed by your need to fit into predetermined categories of who you should be. This is where the real transformation begins, not in the techniques or strategies, but in the fundamental shift of identity, from someone who reacts to life to someone who creates with life. But the deepest level of this transformation, the ultimate realization that makes you truly invincible, is still waiting to be unveiled. Here is the final revelation that will fundamentally alter how you see yourself and reality forever. True invincibility doesn't come from becoming so strong that nothing can hurt you. It comes from becoming so integrated with the creative force of existence itself that destruction and creation become indistinguishable aspects of the same cosmic process. Nietzsche understood something that most philosophers miss. The universe itself is not a static entity to be understood, but a dynamic process of becoming that never stops creating and destroying, building and breaking down, emerging and dissolving. And you, your consciousness, your capacity for choice, your ability to create meaning, are not separate from this process. You are this process becoming aware of itself. This is what he meant by the eternal recurrence, not a literal belief that history repeats, but a psychological test that reveals your relationship to existence itself. If you had to live your exact life, every pain, every joy, every mistake, every triumph, infinite times, would you choose it? The person who can say yes to this question has achieved something beyond invincibility. They have achieved what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate so complete that they become one with the creative destructive force of reality itself. But here's the paradigm shift that changes everything. When you reach this level of integration, you realize that there was never anything to protect in the first place. The self you've been trying to make invincible, your ego, your identity, your story about who you are, is actually the source of all your vulnerability. It's the thing that can be hurt, criticized, rejected, or destroyed. But underneath this, constructed self lies something that cannot be touched by any external circumstance. Viktor Frankl discovered this truth in the concentration camps when he realized that even in the most dehumanizing conditions imaginable, there remained one freedom that could never be taken away: the freedom to choose how to respond to any situation. This isn't the freedom to control what happens, but the freedom to determine what anything that happens means for your continuing self-creation. Carl Jung called this the individuation process, the psychological journey toward becoming a whole, integrated human being who no longer depends on external circumstances to determine their internal state. But Jung understood that this isn't about achieving some perfect state of balance or enlightenment. It's about developing the capacity to consciously participate in your own becoming, rather than being unconsciously shaped by forces outside your awareness. This is why true invincibility often looks like vulnerability to people still trapped in slave morality. The truly strong person doesn't need to appear strong. They can be gentle, because their gentleness comes from choice rather than weakness. They can be vulnerable because their vulnerability comes from courage rather than neediness. They can admit mistakes because their self-worth doesn't depend on being right. They can face criticism because their identity isn't threatened by others' opinions. Arthur Schopenhauer captured this paradox when he observed that a person can do what they will, but not will what they will. You cannot directly control your emotions, thoughts, or immediate reactions, but you can consciously choose what to do with whatever arises. This choice, this gap between stimulus and response, is where your freedom lies, and it's also where your invincibility is forged. But the deepest realization goes even beyond this. When you truly understand that you are not separate from the creative force of existence, you begin to see that everything that happens to you is actually happening through you. The universe isn't acting on you, it's acting as you. Your experiences aren't external events that you have to cope with. They're expressions of the same creative intelligence that you are. This doesn't mean that everything that happens is good or pleasant. It means that everything that happens is part of the ongoing creative process of existence itself, and you are both the artist and the canvas, the sculptor and the marble, the author and the character. From this perspective, the question isn't, how can I become invincible? But how can I participate more consciously in the creative process of my own becoming? Jean-Paul Sartre understood this when he wrote that existence precedes essence. You don't have a fixed nature that determines your possibilities. You exist first, and then create your nature through the choices you make moment by moment. This is simultaneously the most terrifying and the most liberating truth about human existence. There is no predetermined script, no external authority to tell you who you should be, no safety net of inherited meaning. But there is also unlimited creative potential. This is what Nietzsche meant by the Übermensch, not a superior being who dominates others, but a person who has transcended the need for external validation and has learned to create their own values based on their direct experience of what serves life and growth. The Übermensch doesn't follow rules. They create principles. They don't seek approval. They trust their own judgment. They don't avoid suffering. They transform suffering into strength and wisdom. The practical implication of this realization is that you stop trying to become invincible and start recognizing that you already are. Not because nothing can hurt you, but because the you that can be hurt is just one layer of your being. Beneath your personality, your story, your roles and identities, there is something that remains untouched by any external circumstance. The awareness that experiences everything, but is not limited by anything it experiences. This awareness, this witnessing consciousness that remains present, whether you're happy or sad, successful or failing, praised or criticized, is what the ancient traditions called the eternal self. It's not eternal because it lasts forever, but because it exists outside the dimension of time altogether. It's the part of you that was never born and will never die. Not because it's supernatural, but because it's the ground of being itself. When you realize this, not intellectually but as a lived reality, something profound shifts. You stop defending yourself because there's nothing to defend. You stop trying to control outcomes because you recognize yourself as the creative source of whatever happens. You stop seeking meaning because you realize that you are meaning, the universe's way of knowing itself through conscious experience. This is true invincibility, not the ability to avoid destruction, but the recognition that you are the creative force that builds and destroys, creates and dissolves, emerges and returns to the source. You are not in the game of existence. You are the game itself, playing all the parts, creating all the rules, and enjoying the cosmic joke of pretending to be limited when you are actually limitless. Now, if this exploration has touched something deep within you, if you feel the stirring of your own will to power, I invite you to engage with this community of individuals committed to authentic self-creation. Leave a comment sharing your own moment of realization about the difference between false strength and true invincibility. Share this video with someone who might be ready to question everything they think they know about what it means to be human. And remember, the path to invincibility begins the moment you stop trying to become invincible and start recognizing what you already are.